Judith sat in the dimly lit room, her heart pounding. Beauty and the man had just walked out of the other room, laughter still clinging to their voices. They froze when they saw her awake. Beauty's face drained of color, her eyes wide with guilt. The silence between them was heavy, suffocating. Judith didn't say a word. She simply got up, walked past them, and lay back down. But something inside her shifted that night, something that could never be undone. Welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folktales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Judith had always been the kind of person who preferred silence over conversation. In a university filled with noise, where friendships formed and broke within weeks, she stood apart, a quiet figure in the background. She didn't dislike people, but she had never felt the need to belong to a group. Her days followed a routine: classes, the library, a quiet meal, and long walks back to her hostel. It wasn't loneliness, at least not in the way others described it. She simply found comfort in being by herself, in knowing that no one had expectations of her. That changed the day she noticed Beauty. It wasn't immediate, just a passing glance at first. But over time, Judith began to watch her more closely. Beauty was different. There was something effortless about the way she moved through life, always smiling, always talking to someone, yet never seeming to belong to any particular group. What caught Judith's attention most, however, was the way Beauty cared for her younger brother. Unlike most students who left their family lives behind the moment they stepped into university, Beauty carried her responsibility with her. Her brother, a boy no older than 13, visited often, and each time, Beauty treated him with such tenderness that it was impossible not to notice. She made sure he ate well, walked him back home, and even helped him with his homework in the university cafeteria. It was this devotion, this unspoken love between siblings, that stirred something unfamiliar in Judith. She had never been close to anyone like that, had never felt the pull of obligation that came with love. And so she watched, quietly, patiently. At first, Judith had no intention of getting involved. Watching from a distance was enough. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, and the more she observed Beauty, the more she found herself wondering about her. What was it like to have someone rely on you so completely? What was it like to be the kind of person people gravitated toward? Beauty had a warmth that Judith lacked, a lightness in the way she spoke and laughed that made her seem untouchable. Yet she wasn't. Judith had seen the small moments when Beauty's smile faltered, when exhaustion crept into her face as she sat alone, rubbing her temples after a long day. It was in those moments that Judith realized Beauty wasn't as different from her as she had assumed. Perhaps, beneath the surface, she too knew what it meant to feel alone. That realization unsettled Judith. It was easier to believe that people like Beauty lived in a separate world, one of friendships, laughter, and belonging. But what if that wasn't true? What if, despite her cheerful exterior, Beauty was just as alone as she was? The thought lingered, refusing to leave her mind. And with it came a decision, a quiet but certain resolve that she would get closer to Beauty. Not because she needed a friend, but because, for the first time in a long while, she wanted one. Judith had never pursued a friendship before, and she wasn't entirely sure how to start. Beauty was approachable, yes, but that didn't mean she would welcome someone like Judith into her world. So Judith took her time, waiting for the right moment. It came on a rainy afternoon when she found Beauty sitting alone outside the library, her arms wrapped around herself as she stared at the sky. Her usual energy was gone, replaced by something quieter, something distant. Without overthinking it, Judith walked over and sat beside her. For a while, neither of them spoke. The air smelled of wet earth, and raindrops clung to the edges of the library's rooftop, dripping onto the pavement with a steady rhythm. Then, finally, Judith broke the silence. "Do you ever get tired?" Her voice was softer than she intended, almost hesitant. Beauty turned to her, surprised but not unkind. "Of what?" she asked. Judith met her gaze, then looked away. Of doing everything for someone else. Beauty didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, lower, more serious. Sometimes, she admitted, but it's not something I can stop doing. Judith nodded, understanding more in that moment than she had in weeks of watching. And just like that, something shifted between them. A small crack in the distance that separated them. A beginning. The first few weeks of their friendship were quiet, almost fragile, like a thread so thin it could snap at any moment. Judith and Beauty did not immediately fall into the easy rhythm of companionship that others seemed to have. Instead, it was a gradual unfolding, a slow process of learning each other's presence. They didn't talk about personal things right away. Their early conversations were brief, simple exchanges about classes, books, or the weather. But even those small interactions felt different for Judith. She had spent so long existing on the outskirts of people's lives that even the smallest acknowledgement of her presence felt new. Beauty, for her part, didn't force anything. She never pried, never demanded more than what Judith was willing to offer. She had a way of making space for others without crowding them, a skill that Judith admired but didn't quite understand. And yet, despite how natural it all seemed, Judith couldn't ignore the quiet fear lingering in the back of her mind. She had never let someone into her life before. What if she wasn't good at it? What if she disappointed Beauty? The thought unsettled her, but she never voiced it. Instead, she let things unfold at their own pace, careful not to ruin something before it even had the chance to begin. Over time, their interactions stretched beyond brief conversations. They started spending more time together in small, unplanned ways. Judith would find herself lingering after class if she knew Beauty would be there, pretending she had nowhere else to be. Beauty, in turn, started inviting Judith to places. Nothing extravagant, just small moments of shared experience. A quick stop at a cafe between lectures. A quiet evening in Beauty's hostel, cooking something simple while music played softly in the background. Judith found herself easing into these moments, surprised by how much she enjoyed them. There was a warmth to Beauty's presence that made things feel less rigid, less structured. She was the kind of person who could turn even the most ordinary moments into something memorable. Judith, who had spent so much of her life in solitude, wasn't used to this kind of ease, but she didn't resist it either. Instead, she let herself be pulled into Beauty's world step by cautious step. She found herself learning new things, how to cook a dish she had never tried before, how to laugh at something trivial without overthinking it. Beauty made things feel light, and for the first time in a long while, Judith found herself wanting to stay in someone's presence rather than retreating back into her own. It wasn't until Judith went shopping one afternoon that she realized how much Beauty had already become a part of her life. She had wandered into a clothing store, intending to pick up a few things for herself, but as she walked through the aisles, her thoughts drifted to Beauty. She imagined the colors that would suit her, the styles she might like. Without even thinking about it, she picked up a blouse in a soft shade of blue, the same color she had seen Beauty wear once. It was a small thing, but when she handed it to Beauty later that evening, the reaction she received caught her off guard. Beauty's face lit up with genuine surprise, her fingers brushing over the fabric as if it were something delicate and precious. "You thought of me?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. Judith only shrugged, pretending it wasn't a big deal, but something shifted in that moment. It was the first time she had done something for someone without being asked, without obligation. And it felt nice. In return, Beauty began to show her own gestures of care. She would set aside a portion of food whenever she cooked, making sure Judith always had something to eat. She would wait for her after class, even when she didn't have to. They never spoke about these things, never acknowledged them directly, but they didn't need to. It was in the quiet moments, in the effortless ways they had begun to fit into each other's lives, that their friendship truly took root. It started as an ordinary afternoon. Judith and Beauty had finished their classes for the day and decided to stop by a small food stall just outside campus. The place was nothing special, just a little corner shop where students gathered for quick, affordable meals, but it had become one of their regular spots. The air was thick with the scent of fried plantains and peppery stew, mingling with the distant hum of conversation. Judith listened absently as Beauty chatted about something amusing that had happened in class, her voice animated, hands gesturing as she spoke. Judith wasn't particularly hungry, but she enjoyed these moments, Beauty talking, the world moving at its usual pace, and for once, Judith feeling like she was part of it. Then, just as she reached for her drink, she noticed him. He was standing a few feet away, tall and confident, his presence oddly commanding despite the casualness of the setting. He had an easy smile, the kind that seemed practiced but not insincere. Their eyes met for a brief second, and then, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, he walked over. "Hey," he said, his voice smooth and unhurried. "I've seen you around campus." Judith stiffened slightly, unused to being approached so directly. She wasn't the kind of person who attracted attention. She made sure of that. Beauty, ever the social one, glanced between them, a knowing look flashing across her face. "Judith, do you know him?" she asked playfully, nudging her elbow against Judith's side. Judith shook her head, unsure how to respond. The man, who introduced himself as Michael, didn't seem bothered by her hesitation. He was easygoing, his confidence filling the empty spaces of the conversation Judith struggled to navigate. He asked simple questions, things about her course of study, her interests, things most people never bothered to ask. She found herself answering in short, cautious responses, but he didn't seem to mind. There was no pressure, no expectation, just a casual exchange of words. And then, just as smoothly as he had entered the conversation, he pulled out his phone and handed it to her. "Let's stay in touch," he said, flashing that same easy smile. Judith hesitated, but something in his expression, unassuming yet sure, made her take the phone and type in her number. When he walked away a few moments later, Beauty turned to her with a smirk. "Well, that was unexpected," she teased. Judith only hummed in response, unsure of what she was feeling. She had never been the type to make connections so effortlessly, but Michael seemed different, and despite herself, she found that she didn't mind the thought of speaking to him again. The messages started that evening. Nothing overwhelming, just small conversations, check-ins, the occasional joke. Michael wasn't pushy, which Judith appreciated. He had a way of making conversation feel natural, like she wasn't being examined or expected to perform in any way. Over time, their exchanges grew longer, stretching into late-night conversations about nothing and everything. Judith found herself growing comfortable with the rhythm of it, the way he always seemed to know when to ask something deeper and when to keep things light. Beauty noticed, of course. "You like him," she accused one evening, grinning as she watched Judith type out a message. Judith scoffed, but she couldn't deny that she enjoyed Michael's presence in her life. So when he suggested they meet up properly, she agreed without hesitation. She didn't see the harm in it. After all, they were just friends. And when Beauty insisted on tagging along, Judith didn't think twice about it. It felt normal, harmless. She had no way of knowing that this simple decision would change everything. The night air was thick with humidity as Judith, Beauty, and Michael stepped out of the restaurant where they had spent the evening. It had been an easy night, good food, light conversations, and laughter that felt unforced. Judith had been hesitant about meeting Michael at first, unsure of how she would feel seeing him in person again after weeks of messaging. But he was the same as he had been over text, charming without being overbearing, attentive without feeling intrusive. Beauty, on the other hand, had taken to him quickly. She was effortlessly social, making jokes, teasing, slipping into conversations with the kind of ease Judith had never mastered. It hadn't bothered her at first. If anything, she found it comforting. It meant that she didn't have to do all the talking, that Beauty could carry the weight of the moment when Judith's words failed her. But as the night stretched on, something began to shift. Beauty's laughter lingered a little too long. Her touches, brief, fleeting, felt intentional. Judith wasn't sure if she was imagining it, if she was reading too much into something meaningless, so she ignored it. But the feeling sat heavy in her stomach, an unspoken tension she couldn't shake. When Michael suggested they go back to his place, Judith hesitated. It wasn't something she would normally do, but Beauty was there, and that made it feel less like a bad idea. She convinced herself it was harmless, just an extension of the night, just a way to keep the laughter going a little longer. His apartment was simple, neatly kept, smelling faintly of cologne and something warm, like cinnamon. They settled in easily, Beauty stretching out on the couch, Michael pouring drinks. Judith sat near the edge of the room, watching, listening, trying to quiet the nagging voice in the back of her mind. The conversation was fluid at first, but slowly, Judith felt herself growing tired. The night had stretched longer than she intended, and exhaustion was pulling at her. When she mentioned leaving, Beauty had waved her off. "Just rest for a bit," she had said, her voice light, casual. Judith had given in, reclining against the armrest of the couch, letting her eyelids grow heavy. She wasn't asleep, not fully, just resting on the edge of consciousness, aware enough to still hear the hum of conversation. That was why, when Beauty and Michael slipped away into the other room, she noticed. At first, she told herself it was nothing, just a coincidence, just a misunderstanding. But then the door closed, and then there was silence. And in that silence, something inside Judith shattered. She sat up slowly, her heart pounding, her hands gripping the fabric of her dress. She didn't want to believe it, didn't want to acknowledge what was happening just beyond that door. Minutes passed, slow, torturous. She told herself to leave, to get up, to walk away before she could confirm the worst. But she didn't. Instead, she sat there, staring at the closed door, waiting, listening. When they finally emerged, their voices hushed, their steps careful, they froze at the sight of her awake. Beauty's face was the first to shift, her usual confidence faltering, her expression a mix of guilt and shame. Michael, on the other hand, barely reacted. If he felt remorse, it didn't show. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Judith didn't speak. She didn't yell, didn't cry. She simply stood, walked past them, and lay back down. Not because she forgave them, not because it didn't matter, but because in that moment there was nothing to say that could fix what had already been broken. The morning after felt unbearably heavy, though the world outside carried on as if nothing had changed. Sunlight filtered through the window of Michael's apartment, casting long shadows on the floor. Judith had been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint rustling of Beauty moving around the room. She hadn't slept, not really. Her body had been still, her breathing steady, but her mind had been a battlefield of emotions she wasn't ready to name. The weight of the betrayal settled deep in her chest, pressing down with an unbearable force, yet she refused to acknowledge it. To do so would mean accepting the truth of what had happened, and she wasn't sure she was ready for that. Beauty hadn't said a word since she stepped out of that room the night before. She had lingered, waiting, watching, but Judith had offered her nothing. No questions, no accusations, not even a look of anger. And that, Judith realized, was what unsettled Beauty the most. Not rage, not confrontation, but silence. A silence so thick it left no room for excuses. By the time they left Michael's apartment, the quiet between them had grown deafening. Beauty kept glancing at Judith as they walked back to campus, her fingers twitching as if she wanted to reach out, to say something, anything, to break the unbearable stillness between them. But Judith gave her nothing. She wasn't sure what she would have done if Beauty had spoken, if she had tried to explain, to justify, to beg for forgiveness. Maybe she would have listened. Maybe she would have lashed out, letting all the hurt she had swallowed finally spill over. Or maybe she would have walked away, just as she was doing now, letting the silence say everything that words could not. As they approached their hostile, Beauty finally let out a small, nervous laugh, the sound brittle and out of place. "Judith, please," she started, But Judith didn't let her finish. She simply turned, her expression unreadable, and walked inside without another word. The door closing between them felt final, like the slamming of a book whose ending had been rewritten in betrayal. Days passed, then weeks, and still Judith said nothing. Beauty stopped trying after a while, retreating into her own world, pretending as though nothing had happened, as though their friendship had not been quietly buried beneath the weight of that night. Judith watched as Beauty moved on, as she laughed with new friends, as she pretended not to notice the growing distance between them. And for a while, Judith let her. But what Beauty didn't realize was that silence was not the same as forgiveness. Silence could be loud, deafening even, when it carried the weight of something broken beyond repair. Judith didn't need to scream to make Beauty feel the absence of what they once were. She simply had to exist to let her presence be a reminder of what had been lost. And as time went on, she found that she didn't miss Beauty the way she thought she would. The hurt remained, yes, but the longing faded, and in its place, something stronger took root, a quiet resolve, a certainty that she would never again let someone so carelessly into the parts of her life she had guarded for so long. The days melted into weeks, and Judith fell into a routine that felt both familiar and unfamiliar at once. She no longer waited for Beauty outside the lecture hall, or saved her a seat during long classes. The absence of those small habits should have made her feel adrift, but instead she found a quiet comfort in solitude. It was easier this way, cleaner. She could focus on herself without the messiness of betrayal clouding her thoughts. She spent more time in the library, burying herself in textbooks and assignments, losing herself in words that didn't remind her of Beauty's laughter or Michael's easy confidence. But even as she tried to move forward, she could still feel the ghost of that night trailing behind her, lurking in the spaces where Beauty once existed. The unspoken tension between them stretched thin, fragile like glass, that might shatter at the slightest touch. Beauty still lingered around their shared spaces, but she never approached Judith. Instead, she became a presence in the background, always there but never acknowledged. Judith wondered if Beauty thought this was temporary, if she believed that with enough time, Judith would soften, would find it in herself to forgive. But forgiveness was a luxury Judith wasn't ready to afford. One afternoon, as Judith made her way back to her hostel, she noticed something peculiar. Beauty was outside her door, but she wasn't waiting for Judith. She was laughing, her body leaning slightly toward someone else. It took Judith a second to recognize her roommate, a girl named Ada, whom Judith had never been particularly close to. Ada was smiling back, engaged in whatever conversation they were having, and for the first time, Judith saw Beauty as a stranger. The sight of them together shouldn't have bothered her, but a dull ache settled in her chest regardless. It wasn't jealousy, it was something else, something deeper. Perhaps it was the realization that Beauty had found someone new to fill the void Judith had left, that she had replaced their friendship as easily as one replaces an old, worn-out garment. Judith hesitated at the entrance, watching the way Beauty's eyes lit up, the way her voice held that same effortless charm that once made Judith feel special. And then, as if sensing her gaze, Beauty glanced up. Their eyes met just for a second, and Judith saw it, the flicker of something unreadable in Beauty's expression. But instead of holding her gaze, Beauty looked away, returning her attention to Ada, as if Judith had never existed at all. That night, Judith sat on her bed, her mind restless. She had told herself that Beauty's actions no longer mattered, that she had severed any emotional ties that once bound them together. But the truth was, the betrayal still sat heavy in her chest. It wasn't just what Beauty had done that hurt, it was how easily she had moved on, how effortlessly she had stepped into a new friendship without so much as looking back. Judith had spent weeks in silence, expecting that silence to be something Beauty carried too. But it was clear now that the weight of their broken friendship rested solely on Judith's shoulders, and perhaps that was what hurt the most. Just as she was about to push the thoughts away, her phone buzzed. A message. Her fingers hesitated before unlocking the screen, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something shift. The sender's name wasn't Beauty. It wasn't Michael. It was someone new, someone who, unknowingly, would change the course of Judith's life once again. The message sat on Judith's screen, unfamiliar yet strangely inviting. She hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. It was from a number she didn't recognize, but the words were simple. "Hi, Judith. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I just wanted to say hello." There was no name, no indication of who it might be, but something about the message felt intentional, like it wasn't just a casual greeting but an opening, an invitation to something unknown. She debated ignoring it. After everything that had happened, she wasn't sure she was ready to let another person into her life. But then, against her better judgment, she replied, "Who is this?" The response came quickly. "Daniel. We have a class together. I sit a few rows behind you." Judith frowned slightly, trying to recall a face to match the name. She vaguely remembered a quiet presence in the back of the lecture hall, someone who never really stood out. He wasn't like Michael. He didn't command attention or move with an air of confidence. But now, here he was, reaching out. "Oh," she typed back. "I see. How did you get my number?" His reply was immediate. "From a mutual friend. I hope that's okay." Something about the honesty in his response made Judith pause. He wasn't pretending to be someone he wasn't. He had taken a chance, and that, more than anything, intrigued her. Over the next few days, their conversations became more frequent, flowing effortlessly like a river winding its way through unfamiliar terrain. Daniel wasn't like anyone Judith had known before. He was patient, never pressing for more than she was willing to give. He didn't flood her with compliments or empty words. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions, as if he genuinely wanted to understand the way her mind worked. She found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected, sharing small details about her life, things she had kept locked away even from Beauty. And Daniel listened. Really listened. He remembered the little things, bringing them up in later conversations, as if they mattered. "You mentioned you like quiet places," he texted one evening. "There's a bookshop near campus that's almost always empty. Want to check it out?" Judith stared at the message for a long moment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The thought of meeting him in person, of stepping into something new, filled her with a strange mix of apprehension and curiosity. But there was something about Daniel, something steady, something that made her feel safe. And so, she found herself typing a response before she could talk herself out of it. "Okay. When?" The bookshop was just as Daniel had described, quiet, tucked away from the busy streets, its shelves lined with books that smelled of old pages and forgotten stories. When Judith arrived, Daniel was already there, browsing through a worn-out novel, with a soft smile on his face. He looked up when he saw her, his expression warm but not overwhelming. "Hey," he said simply, as if they had been meeting like this forever. Judith felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, something that wasn't fear or hesitation, but possibility. They wandered through the aisles, their conversation flowing easily between discussions of literature and life. Judith had expected awkwardness, but there was none. Daniel had a way of making silence feel comfortable, of making even the smallest exchanges feel significant, and as the evening stretched on, she realized something. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about the past. She wasn't thinking about Beauty or Michael, or the pain that had lingered for weeks. She was simply here, in this moment, with someone who made her feel seen. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Days turned into weeks, and Judith found herself slipping into a new rhythm, one that no longer revolved around the echoes of past betrayals. She still carried the weight of them, of course, but with Daniel, the burden didn't feel so heavy. He had a way of making space for her without demanding too much, of allowing her to exist without expectation. The conversation stretched late into the nights, sometimes over text, sometimes in person, always flowing effortlessly. Judith wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere along the way, her walls began to lower. She caught herself laughing more, the kind of laughter that came naturally, not the forced politeness she had grown used to after everything with Beauty. Daniel never pried into her past, never asked why she sometimes hesitated before answering certain questions, or why she looked away when their conversations grew too personal. Instead, he gave her the kind of quiet patience that made her feel safe. And for the first time in a long while, Judith allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, not everyone was waiting to hurt her. One evening, as they sat by the small cafe near campus, Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her with quiet amusement. "You're different than I expected," he mused, sipping his coffee. Judith raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" He shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "You seem like the kind of person who keeps to herself, but when you talk, there's so much depth." Judith felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Something warm, something dangerous. She wasn't used to being seen, not like this. Beauty had always been the one to command attention, the one who filled spaces effortlessly while Judith stood in the background. But with Daniel, she wasn't a shadow. She was something real, something worth paying attention to. She looked down at her cup, fingers tracing the rim. "I guess I got used to being careful with people." It was the closest she had come to admitting the truth. Daniel didn't push. He just nodded, as if he understood. And maybe he did. Maybe that was what made him different. He didn't need every answer, every piece of her history, to care. He simply let her be, and somehow, that was enough. That night, as Judith walked back to her room, the air cool against her skin, she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She had spent so much time guarding herself, convinced that letting people in only led to disappointment. But Daniel had managed to slip through the cracks, not by forcing his way in, but by waiting patiently until she was ready. She didn't know what this was yet, what they were becoming, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't afraid. And that, in itself, was something she hadn't felt in a long time. As she reached her hostel, her eyes briefly caught sight of Beauty standing a few feet away, laughing with Ada. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, but this time, Judith felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just an odd sense of detachment, as if Beauty belonged to a different part of her life, one that no longer had control over her. And as she stepped inside her room, closing the door behind her, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to move forward. As the weeks stretched on, Judith settled into the quiet comfort of her new reality. The past no longer held the same power over her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt steady. Her days were filled with classes, late-night study sessions, and long conversations with Daniel, who had seamlessly become a part of her life. He never demanded more than she was willing to give, never pushed her beyond her boundaries, and in that, Judith found solace. Their connection was slow, unhurried, built on mutual understanding rather than fleeting attraction. It was different from anything she had experienced before, and while a small part of her feared its fragility, she chose to embrace it anyway. Yet, despite the calm she had carefully woven around herself, shadows of the past still lingered at the edges. Beauty was no longer an active presence in her life, but she wasn't gone either. Their paths crossed often, too often for Judith's liking. Beauty still laughed in the same hallways, still sat with Ada in the cafeteria, still carried on as though nothing had ever happened. And though Judith had promised herself that she wouldn't care, there were moments, fleeting but sharp, where the ache of what had been would return uninvited. One afternoon, Judith was leaving the library when she heard her name being called. The voice was familiar, but not one she had expected to hear again. She turned, her heart sinking as she met Michael's gaze. He looked the same, confident, composed, as though time had not touched him in the way it had touched her. "Judith, it's been a while," he said, stepping closer. She stiffened, gripping the strap of her bag. "What do you want?" Her tone was measured, controlled, but inside she felt the walls she had so carefully built start to tremble. Michael sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I never got the chance to explain. That night—" "I don't need an explanation," Judith cut in, her voice sharper than she intended. She didn't want to hear whatever excuse he had prepared, didn't want to relive that moment when she had woken up to find her trust shattered. But Michael wasn't deterred. "I messed up," he admitted. "I should have been honest with you. I should have handled things differently." Judith stared at him, searching for any trace of sincerity in his expression. She wasn't sure what she had expected, that he would deny it, make excuses, twist the truth like so many others had. Instead, he stood there, waiting as if hoping for some form of absolution. And maybe, in another lifetime, she would have given it. But not now. Not after everything. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Michael, I moved on. You should too." The words felt final, and for the first time, she meant them. Michael nodded, exhaling slowly, as if accepting defeat. "I get it," he said. I hope you're happy." Judith didn't respond. She didn't need to. Instead, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the fading light of the evening. As she neared her hostel, her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Are you free? I found a place you might like." A small smile tugged at her lips as she typed her response. The past would always be there, lingering in the background, but for the first time, Judith realized that it no longer defined her. She had a choice to hold on to the hurt or to step forward into something new. And as she made her way toward Daniel, she knew exactly what she was choosing. The evening air was crisp as Judith made her way to the meeting spot Daniel had mentioned, a quiet park on the edge of campus, where the sounds of the city faded into the rustling of leaves and the distant murmur of water from a small fountain. She hadn't realized how much she needed this until now. The encounter with Michael had left a lingering unease within her, not because she still cared for him, but because it had forced her to confront just how much she had changed. There was a time when his words would have shaken her, when the mere sight of him would have sent her spiraling back into doubt and pain. But today, she had walked away without looking back, and in doing so, she had finally reclaimed a part of herself that had been lost. Daniel was already there when she arrived, leaning casually against a wooden bench, his hands tucked into his pockets. His face lit up when he saw her, a silent understanding passing between them. Without a word, he gestured for her to sit beside him, and she did, inhaling deeply as the calmness of the place settled around her. For a while, neither of them spoke. There was no rush, no need to fill the silence with meaningless chatter. Daniel had a way of making even the quiet moments feel significant, as if simply being in each other's presence was enough. Finally, he glanced at her, his eyes searching. "You seem different tonight," he noted. Judith tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "I think I finally let go," she admitted, surprising even herself. Saying it aloud made it feel real, like a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying had finally been lifted. Daniel didn't ask for details. He never did. Instead, he simply smiled, as if he had known all along that this moment would come. "Good," he said softly. "You deserve that." His words settled deep within her, warming the places that had once been cold with resentment and regret. For so long, she had held onto her pain, believing that it defined her. But sitting here, in the company of someone who saw her for who she was now, not who she had been, she understood that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about making peace with it. As the night stretched on, they talked about everything and nothing, future dreams, childhood memories, favorite books, and with each passing moment, Judith felt something unfamiliar take root inside her, hope. She wasn't naive enough to believe that every wound had been healed, or that she wouldn't still have moments of doubt. But she no longer felt trapped by her past, no longer felt like she was running from the people who had hurt her. She had found her own footing, her own strength, and in doing so, She had created space for something new. When it was time to leave, Daniel walked her back to her hostel, their steps slow and unhurried, as if neither of them wanted the night to end just yet. As they reached the entrance, he hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Judith, whatever happens next, just know I'm here." There was no pressure in his words, no expectation, just a quiet promise. And for the first time in a long while, Judith felt safe enough to believe it. She met his gaze, offering a small but genuine smile. "I know." Then, with a final glance at the world she had left behind, she stepped inside, closing the door not just on the night, but on everything that no longer had power over her. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.